On time. We're going to have a lot of fun today talking about teaching problem validation. So obviously we're going to talk a lot about problems today, including your problems. And as I've mentioned already, we're going to use those to shape some of our discussion today. So we want to know what your challenges are teaching problem validation. So if you haven't already, fill out that form. And then you can actually, after you fill it out, you'll see everyone else's challenges as well. So fill that out. While you're doing that, let me give you a quick tour of our platform here. So directly below me, you'll see a place for you to ask questions. So go ahead and ask any questions that you have down there, and then you can actually upvote other people's questions that you'd like to hear. Throughout this session, Doan will be actually moderating those questions and help us prioritize those. And just a heads up, you should know that we got a lot to talk about today, so we're probably going to answer most of the questions at the back half or at the very end of the session today. But we will take some interstitial ones. If this video screen ever is too small for you when we're doing the exercises, you can click directly below me is a full screen button. Click on the full screen button and it'll make this video full screen. Hit escape to get out of there. If you ever need to make the videos bigger or smaller by incremental bits, just to my right is a slider. You can take that slider and slide it to the left or right and you'll be able to make it bigger or smaller. On my right-hand side, full over, in the middle of your screen, is where we're going to have all of our exercises today. So right now, you already have a survey that you can fill out. I'm also going to turn on the slides. So throughout this session, you will have access to the slides that we are going to use. That means that if I go too quickly, if I go too slow, you'll be able to jump around and do whatever you want with your own copy of the slides. You can also view them, share them, clip them, do whatever you want. Those slides are yours. All right, so with that, that's our tour of the platform. You should also know this is a custom-built platform that we've built, so if you have any feedback or issues, please let us know. We'll be collecting your feedback at the end of this session as well. All right, so with that, let me introduce my good colleague, Doan Winkle. So Doan, if you want to just say a few words about who you are and why people should listen to you, we'll get the show started.
Sure. So I'm Doan Winkle. Thank you. Nice to meet you all. Thanks for coming. I teach entrepreneurship at John Carroll University starting in the fall, and I'm a huge proponent and really very passionate about encouraging experiential entrepreneurship education and getting students out and actually doing things and learning by doing. And so partnering up with Justin, and I'm very excited about providing resources for other faculty to learn how to do this and be able to do this a little more effectively in their classrooms.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Doan. And my name is Justin Wilcox. So I teach entrepreneurship outside of the academic setting. So I teach in accelerators for entrepreneurs, and I teach in corporate environments for entrepreneurs. And Doan and I are sort of collaborating, his perspective on the academic, his perspective on the academic world and my perspective outside, and we're kind of taking the best of both worlds to bring to you today how to talk about problem validation. So with that in mind, let's talk about and make sure we're all on the same page about why we're going to emphasize problem validation so much. And the reason is something you already know, and it's probably something you already teach. And that is that customers don't buy products. Our students' customers buy solutions to problems. So if we are not teaching our students how to understand and validate the problems of their customers, we are not teaching our students entrepreneurship. This is the core, the heart of entrepreneurship. And so it's imperative that we understand how to teach our students how to validate their customers' problems. Because when we do that, something really interesting happens. During the problem validation process, we're going to knock out several components of the business model. So we're going to validate the customer segments portion of the business model. We're going to validate the value proposition sections of the business model. And while we do that, and as a direct result of the conversations we have with our customers, we're also going to validate the customer relationships and the channels components of their business models. So this here, like you see, the problem validation covers the entire top right quadrant of the business model canvas. And from this quadrant here, the rest of the business model flows. So once we know channel segments, value proposition, customer relationships, and channels, we know what our revenue stream should be and our cost structure and our key activities, resources, and partners. And so this is the heart and soul of entrepreneurship. So that's why we're going to focus so much on this. And speaking of why it's so important to do this, let's talk about the challenges of doing this. So Doan has been reading and looking through the problem so far, and he's going to tell us some of the patterns he's seen in the challenges that you guys have in terms of teaching this. So Doan, what have you seen so far?
Yeah, a lot of challenges, which is very exciting for me in terms of this. But a couple sort of themes or patterns jump out. One has to do with motivating students to discover what a lot of people are referring to as real problems, and getting them to think about real customer needs. Another is getting students not jumping to solutions, so getting them to hold back and focus on actual problems and go about validating that stuff and before they jump to kind of solutions and building things. Effectively teaching how to talk to customers, and then also problems with students going out and validating on non-customers, or how to kind of identify the right folks to validate on. Seems to be some of the main patterns coming out. But again, lots and lots of really good problems, which is exciting for Justin and I because we got a lot of work to do.
Awesome, great, Doan. And thank you so much, everyone, for filling that out. So what I heard is that we need to make sure that we're talking about real customer needs, so we're not talking about fictitious things that don't exist. I heard that we need to tackle real problems, talking to how to talk to customers, and making sure that we're talking to the right customers. And I've got some good news, my friends, because we are going to nail those things today. So we're going to help you a little bit with those different issues. And we're going to start by talking about problem validation in 4 different components. So 4 different components of problem validation. Step number 1, you want to make sure that you are teaching, that you have your students bought in to the problem validation process. So if you are seeing that your students are jumping straight to products and they're not spending enough time on problems, it's because they are not bought into the validation process. And so we're going to talk a little bit today about how to help them get bought into this process. Second thing we're going to talk about, how to help your students hypothesize problems that they are uniquely suited to solve. This is where we're going to actually find some really impactful business ideas. So if you ever have challenges in terms of students coming up with not particularly interesting or impactful ideas, we're going to solve that because we're going to flip the script a little bit and focus on problems instead. Third thing we're going to talk about, problem discovery. So for those of you who want to help make sure your students are interviewing customers and interviewing the right customers the right way, we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that today. And then finally, we're going to talk about problem confirmation. So it turns out it's not enough just to talk to people about their problems. We have to actually confirm that customers want to solve them. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that as well. So those are the 4 sections we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about them with exercises. So for each one of these, we're going to give you guys an exercise that you can take a look at and use as inspiration, or potentially use in your class. So this is the question that we want you to be thinking about throughout this entire session is, do you want to use these types of exercises in your classroom? If you do, great. We'll talk about how to do that later on. And even if you don't, we'll talk about how you can take these and use them as inspiration for your own exercises going forward. All right, so with that said, let's dive in and talk about how to get students bought into this problem validation mindset. The way that we like to talk about getting buy-in for problem validation mindset is talk about the difference between inventors and entrepreneurs. Now, inventors are amazing, amazing people who build amazing, amazing things. Entrepreneurs, they build amazing things too, but there's a big distinction between them and inventors. Entrepreneurs build things that people buy. And so what you can explain to your students is that an inventor builds things that they love, that they are excited about creating. An entrepreneur creates things that other people are excited about, that other people are so excited about that they will actually buy the thing that's being created. So an inventor focuses internally on themselves, and an entrepreneur focuses externally on their customers. So some examples of what happens that you can show your students. If you have the inventor mindset, you will create an amazing thing that no one cares about, like the Segway. If you were an entrepreneur, you will see that there is something really inherently amazing here, but it's not a Segway. It's not something that requires you to strap on a helmet, right? A derivative product that's focused more on the customer's needs to have a certain look or a certain feel to evoke a certain emotion is going to be much more successful as an entrepreneurial endeavor than an invention, no matter how cool it is. Another example to use with your students, ask your students to raise their hand if they have used Google Plus within the last month. Ask, and then you'll see no one's hand goes up because no one uses Google Plus anymore. Now, this is despite the fact that thousands, literally thousands of engineers at Google, primary focus was to beat Facebook in the social game. Despite all of that, they failed tremendously because they were focused on their needs to beat Facebook. They weren't focused on their customers' needs. Now, ask your students, how many of you guys have used Snapchat in the last week? Watch their hands shoot up. Tell them that while Google had thousands of engineers working on it, Snapchat started with two people. 2 people took down all of Google Plus, beat them at their own game. Why? Because they were focused on their customers' problems, not their own problems. Ask them how many people were using WhatsApp. You'll see hands raised again. Again, 2 people take on thousands of them because they're focused on their customers' needs, not their own. All right, so those are some basic examples to just lay the foundation for your students. And you can also reinforce this idea by making sure your students know that the difference between an entrepreneur and an inventor is that an entrepreneur knows customers buy products. Excuse me, customers don't buy products, customers buy solutions to problems. All right, so let's get into the exercise that can help drive this idea home. So I'm going to turn on the problems, not products exercise here. So I'll make this active. I'm going to take away the survey here just to make it a little cleaner for you. All right, so what we're going to do here, this is an exercise that you can walk your students through. It's called Problems, Not Products. And it actually walks your students through the origin stories of several of the startups that they are familiar with. So Airbnb, Facebook, Uber, ClassPass, Yelp, Dropbox. And what your students are going to do is they're actually going to read the origin stories for each of these companies. And then they're going to do a little analysis on the very first version of that company. So in our case, we're going to go through this together for just one of the cases. We're going to go do Airbnb. And instead of having you read something, I'm just going to tell you about the origin story, and then we'll sort of analyze it together. All right, so as your students read the origin of Airbnb, what they'll realize is that Airbnb didn't start out as Airbnb. Airbnb started out as Airbed and Breakfast. And that's because the founders were living in San Francisco and realized that there was a big design conference coming to town. And with that big design conference came a big problem. The problem was that there were no affordable hotel rooms left for people who were attending the conference. So what they decided to do is run an experiment to see if they can solve this problem, if they can actually validate that there's a problem here. So they rented out their living room space. They put 3 airbeds in their living room, charged $80 a night, and they created a website to see if people actually wanted to rent out these airbeds. What they realized is not only that people wanted to rent out their space and there was a real problem for these hotel attendees, they also realized that other people wanted to use the site that they put together to rent out their own floor space. Okay, so with this origin story in mind, let's go understand the very first version of Airbnb, Airbed and Breakfast, not in terms of the first product that they created, but in terms of the problem that they solved. So I'm going to invite you to do this with me, just like your students would. So your students can come in here and they can say, hey, who were the very first customers here? And note that we don't want them thinking about like business travelers, because business travelers is a very vague definition of a customer segment. And you want your students thinking about real specific customers. So in this case, we're going to actually type in, so who were their first customers? Design conference attendees. And then we're going to ask them, well, where were they trying to solve these problems? Like, where were they experiencing these problems? Where were they finding these people? And then you want your students to focus on the specific location. So San Francisco. what they'll realize in going through these origins of these big companies is they'll realize they all started in very, very specific regions. They didn't try and boil the ocean and try and solve problems for the entire world at once. And then your students are going to actually analyze, well, what was the problem that they solved in the words of their own customer? So the problem they solved was, I have a problem. I can't find a hotel room for less than $200. Oops. $200. There we go. All right, so what your students will do by going through the origin stories of startups that they're familiar with is they'll see over and over and over again a consistent pattern. They will see that the large companies that they look to and respect all started very, very small. And they all started solving real problems. So this does a couple things. They're going to start to see the pattern over and over again, like, oh my gosh, I need to focus on problems because that's what all these big successful companies did. They're also going to get some increased confidence because these big companies, they'll realize all started in one city, oftentimes as a result of work done at a university. Okay, so that, my friends, is our first exercise, and it's called Problems Not Products. Know that if you want to save it, there's actually a button in the top right-hand corner. You can actually use this as a takeaway. If you click the Save to Google Drive button, you'll have a copy of this. If you want to use this exercise in class, then just let us know. We'll talk to you about how to do that. Otherwise, if you want to just use it as an inspiration for your own exercise that you create up yourself, feel free to have a copy and play around with it. But this is one of the great ways to get buy-in for the problem validation is by showing your students how other companies have done the same thing, solving problems to find their success. All right, so that's the buy-in stuff. Do we have any burning questions in terms of buy-in that we should talk about before we move on?
No, I think we're good to move on for the moment.
Okay, great, cool. So if you guys have questions, feel free to toss them in. Like I said, we'll either tackle them during the session or we'll sort of take them at the end. All right, so we talked about buy-in. Students are stoked. They get why we're going to be focused on problems. Now we need to help them hypothesize problems that they are uniquely suited to solve. Now, where this normally comes up and is a problem is in the idea generation phase. Lots of times we try and teach our students to come up with creative ideas for businesses, and this always fails. Why? Because customers don't care about products anyway. Right? So we need to get our students focused not on idea generation, but instead what customers really care about, and that's problem generation. So our next exercise is actually going to be a problem generation exercise. So let me turn that bad boy on. I'll make this one active. And the very first step of this idea generation exercise is actually to cross out the word idea. So your students are going to realize, oh, right, we don't care about ideas anymore. So I'm going to invite you to do this. Cross out the word idea and write in the word problem. Because this is going to be a problem generation process, a problem brainstorming process. And what you're going to help your students do is brainstorm the problems that they are uniquely suited to solve by brainstorming the people they are uniquely suited to serve. So we'll do this together. So I want you to come up with 5 different groups of people that you are uniquely suited to serve because you are a member of them. You are one of them. So right up, I'll get started and I'll say, I'm an entrepreneurship teacher. Right? So I'm going to fill these out. I'm going to be quiet so you guys can think, but fill out and come up with at least 5 segments that you are a member of so you can feel what it's like for your students to go through this problem generation process. All right, so as you come up with your segments, know that when you walk your students through this kind of process, you can also invite them to write up the segments that they used to be members of and the groups of people that they are simply passionate about serving. And these groups of people after they brainstorm them all, they'll probably come up with somewhere between 15 and 30 different groups of people that they have some advantage of solving problems for. Some advantage because they understand these problems particularly well, or they are simply passionate about solving them. All right, so once they have all of their problems or all the customer segments lined up, then you're going to invite them to pick one of those segments. In fact, actually pick 3 of those segments. It can be from any one of these categories, it doesn't matter. But for you guys, I'm going to have you just pick one. So pick one segment, entrepreneurship teacher. You can pick any segment you want. And then brainstorm 5 problems that a member of the segment might be encountering in their daily lives or on a regular basis. So in my case, for an entrepreneurship teacher, well, what do we know? We heard that there were problems in terms of students focus on problems, not products. Now I'm cheating here because I'm not hypothesizing so much. You told me what the problems were. But if I was hypothesizing, I might say like, hard to grade students who work in teams. What I want you to notice when you're going through this step is how your brain has to shift. Your brain has to shift from thinking about what you want to do and what problems you want to solve into what problems this person might have. So you're actually having to put yourself in the shoes of the person, the customer that wants to be served. And this is going to help your students have an empathetic mindset and really see the world from their customer's perspective. So that's why this can also help with the buy-in process, because you're helping to help them understand how to see the world from their customer's perspective. All right, so this is the problem generation process. Again, if you want to save a copy of this, you can click up here in the top right-hand corner, just above my cursor here, and you can save a copy of this. And like I said, you can use that as inspiration for your own exercise if you want to create your own. Okay, so that's the problem generation process, how to help them hypothesize their problems. Now that they have a set of great problems to go out and solve, we need to help them with the problem discovery process. So we need to make sure your students know exactly who to interview, how to ask for interviews, and how to make sure and validate that the problems that they hypothesized are real problems that customers are trying to solve. So, as you guys already know, customer interviews are the most powerful tool in terms of problem discovery. There are several things that you want to teach your students, as I alluded to before. You need to teach them who to ask, which you guys already talked about. We need to ask them how to ask for interviews. And then we have to make sure that we teach them what to ask during those interviews. And we've got some tools and exercises to cover all of those things, but we don't have time to do that right now. But we do have time to focus on one of these areas, which is one of the ones that you asked about, which is who to ask for interviews. How to make sure they're interviewing the right customers. Now, in terms of making sure students interview the right customers, we are big proponents of making sure they're talking to early adopters. And by early adopters, what we mean are people who are currently seeking a solution to the hypothesized problem. So we want to help your students find people out there who are already seeking a solution to the problem that they want to solve for 2 reasons. The first reason is that people who are already seeking a solution are the most hungry for one, which means they are the most likely to try a new solution from an unknown entity, like a startup or a new company. So the early adopters are clearly the most likely to use your students' products and purchase your students' products. The other reason we want them to look for people who are seeking a solution to the problem is that if they can't find their early adopters, if they can't find people who are already trying to solve this problem, it doesn't mean it's not a problem or that it's not a good problem. It just means that now probably isn't the time to solve the problem. You can explain to your students, if no one around the world is actively trying to solve this problem, that means they're going to have to spend all of the time educating people that they have a problem. That means they're going to have to spend all their time trying to get their attention instead of actually solving the problem. And it's going to be a huge waste of time. So this is great because it will either tell them, finding their early adopters will either tell them they're on the right track to solving a real problem, or tell them they need to pivot and solve a different problem. All right, so let's talk about how to help them find their early adopters. The exercise we're going to talk about here is one called Your Early Adopters, and it's going to walk them through how to figure out who their early adopters are and where to find them. So let me turn this one on. So you guys should have access to this now. And this one I really want to encourage you to participate in and write up with me because there's some cool stuff I kind of want to show you as a result of it. So as we go through this, your students will normally fill this out for their own idea, but you can simply fill it out for our airbed and breakfast example. So the segment we want to first highlight here, or the first thing we want to do is we want to highlight who the customer segment is. So who's the broad customer segment? We talked about this already. These are design conference attendees. So go ahead and write in design conference attendees for your segment. Then your students are going to write down the problem that these customers might be trying to solve in the customer's own words. So our design conference attendees would write in the problem, I can't find a hotel room for less than $200. And how you can explain early adopters to your students is by comparing early adopters to early majority, late majority, and laggards with respect to the hypothesized problem. And let me show you what I mean. I usually start off by explaining what laggards are. So laggards are the people who belong in this customer segment. They are a member of this group, but they literally do not have the hypothesized problem. So by that I mean someone who's going to this design conference and got their hotel room 6 months ahead of time, they do not have this problem. They got a good deal on their hotel rate, which means they are not going to be an early adopter for sleeping on some apartment floor airbed, right? So because they don't have this problem, they don't know that they have the problem, and they are not actively seeking a solution to this problem. Now, you can contrast that for your students with the late majority. Late majority are people who have the problem, but don't know that they have the problem. If you're ever hearing students like trying to convince people that they have a problem, trying to educate them that they have a problem, that means they're talking to the late majority, someone who they can see has the problem, but the person themselves does not see it. So an example in this case might be someone who is attending the design conference on someone else's dime. So let's say maybe their company is paying for the design conference. So yeah, they can't find a hotel room for less than $200, but they don't care. Not their money. So they're a late majority. There's no way that they're going to go sleep on someone else's airbag when someone else is paying for their hotel room. Because they don't know they have the problem, they are not actively seeking a solution for that problem. Now you can talk about the difference between them and the early majority, where the early majority are people who have the problem and know that they have the problem. They will acknowledge that they have a problem. But it's not such a big problem that they're actively seeking a solution for it. So now someone who might fall into this category is someone who says, yeah, oh my gosh, I can't find a hotel room for less than $200, so I'm just simply not going to go. I'm going to skip out. So in this case, again, this is someone who's very close to being our customer, but not quite. Maybe if someone told them about this kind of solution, maybe they would try it. If someone they trusted said, hey, go check out this airbed and breakfast thing, maybe they'd try it. But they're not so hungry to solve it that they're going to go look for a solution on their own. And they probably won't try an untrusted one because it's just simply not that big of a problem. Now, you get to introduce the idea of early adopters to your students. And early adopters are who they're looking for. These are the people who have the problem that your students are trying to solve. They know that they have the problem, and they are actively seeking a solution. And this is where it gets fun. It gets fun because your students can actually describe the behaviors that someone would take, things that someone would do that tells them that a person is an early adopter. So I'm going to invite you to do that now. I'm going to invite you to actually write up the behaviors of someone who is actively seeking a solution to this problem. So try and come up with at least 5 problems. 5 behaviors. 5 behaviors someone would demonstrate that says, yes, I am trying to actively solve this problem. I'll start you off with one. I'll give you one for free. First one, searches for hostels. So fine, hotel rooms are all booked up, they're too expensive. I'll go search for a hostel and I'll see if I can stay there. So you try and see if you can come up with at least 4 more problems. I'm going to give you a couple minutes to go do that. All right, everyone. Hopefully you've had a chance to go in and take a look or fill in some of these different problems, some of these different behaviors. I'm just going to go take a look and see what we've got here so far. Oops. Okay, so let's see what we got here. Behaviors. Calling friends and family. All right. So what I wanted to demonstrate here is, first off, that you guys get it. So calling friends and family in San Francisco. But this is actually one of our attendees. So one of you lucky people I'm going to use as a demo. It's totally anonymous, so no one knows who you are. But you'll notice that as they are continuing to fill this out, I can actually see what they're writing in, which means that I can actually leave feedback on these. And they're awesome. Like, I love this one. So I'm going to actually follow. If this is yours, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to say, like, this is a great example. Let's see, chaps up, others uncomfortable. This is perfect. I love this. So whoever this is, you're doing fantastically. Searches for hostile, other alternatives, calling friends and family. Yes, this is perfect. Okay, so you get what's going on here. And what's great is about this platform, the reason why I wanted to show this to you is that we're working on this curriculum, and part of this, what we're doing is to sort of test this out and see if people are interested in a full-fledged curriculum. But if we get enough demand, we would love to actually build these kind of tools into classroom management. And what we mean by that is imagine your students being able to fill these out either in your class physically or away from class as homework or as part of an online course. No matter what, they can fill it out and you can actually leave comments about what they're writing up. Right, so you can give them direct feedback. And you'll notice that as I'm talking, the person who is whose worksheet this is actually writing as well. So not only can you and your students collaborate, they can collaborate with each other in teams. So that's just a little hint about something we would like to build. I can't promise that we will build this into the platform of the curriculum, but it's just a hint of kind of where we would like to go if we do see enough demand, kind of where we're headed. But this is wonderful. So thank you so much for participating. You totally understand what we're doing and you get it, and that's beautiful. And thank you for being my guinea pig here. Okay, so we're gonna keep going, but I will also want to invite you guys to ask any questions you have. Because I think we're going to have a little bit of time. So if you have questions about any of these processes, about teaching, things we missed, any comments about things that we're missing or things that you teach differently, please let us know. So go ahead and fire those questions away, and then Doan will prioritize them for us to answer later. Okay, so some of the different examples we had of problems. So there were some great ones here that our friend had. I'm going to list some other ones in terms of asks. About room share on forums, which is exactly what our colleague had written up. Ask about friends' places to stay, again, another great example. Tries couch surfing, stays far away, etc. So your students are going to brainstorm all of these behaviors of their target customers, their early adopters. Now the next step is when you're going to teach them how to turn those behaviors into what we call externally observable behaviors. And what that means is just because someone searches for a hostel doesn't mean that your students are going to be able to find them and ask them for an interview. So what they need to do is convert this into what we call an externally observable behavior, which means it's a behavior, but it's a behavior they can observe as an external party. So how do we know if someone is searching for a hostel? Well, they can't really tell if they're Googling for it, but if they ask about it on Facebook, if they ask about it on Twitter, if they go on some design forum, then all of a sudden they've identified themselves as early adopters. And so your students are going to convert each of these into these externally observable behaviors, and that's going to do something really powerful for them. That's going to tell them exactly where to find their early adopters. And if they can't come up with these early adopters, or these externally observable behaviors, that's going to tell them that it's going to be very, very difficult to build a company out of solving these problems. Because if they can't find people to try and solve this problem now, they're not going to have anyone to talk to about their problems. And if they can't find people to talk to about problems, they certainly aren't going to get anyone to pay them to solve those problems. And so this is kind of a make or break exercise, that if they can do this, they're off and running, they can interview the right customers. If they can't do this, that means that there's probably not the right customers to interview anyway. All right, so with that said, that's a little bit about customer interviewing. Again, there are three different topics that we want to cover here. And don't, just a heads up, your mic is on. Okay, so.
Ooh, that could be fun.
Yeah, right. Okay, so so the three things that it's really important for you guys to teach your students about is who to ask for interviews, early adopters, how to ask for interviews. You need to make sure they know how to actually make contact with this small group of people to ensure they have a high conversion rate in terms of getting those interviews. And then we need to make sure they know what to ask during those interviews. So if you have any questions about those, let us know. We've got some exercises for them, but what we talked about and highlighted today was who to ask for those interviews. All right, so now that you've watched your students through the discovery process, they've gone out, they've done a bunch of interviews, they've analyzed them, it's time to do the problem confirmation process. Problem confirmation really means that a problem isn't validated. We haven't finished validating a problem just because someone talks about it. A problem isn't validated until customers pay to solve it. So we start the problem validation journey way, way long time ago on just ideation on problems. And we will go through customer interviews. We'll go through solution ideation. We'll go through market testing. We'll go through MVP building. We'll go through all of this. And we haven't validated that a problem is validated until someone actually pays to solve it. And we have pay here in quotes because not every startup or every initiative or every entrepreneur is collecting revenue from their customers. A lot of times people are paying with their data, paying with their usage, or paying with cash. And so pay is in quotes, but it doesn't matter what. Your students haven't validated their problem until someone has paid them to solve it. And so you need to give them the experience and teach them how to go and actually test and see if people will pay them to solve their problem. So we got an exercise to help there as well. And that exercise, that step is called the currency test. And a currency test is exactly what it sounds like. Your students are going to go out and they're going to ask for currency from their customers. They're going to ask for something valuable in exchange for solving their problem. So the currency test requires three things. First thing, it requires a marketing channel. So your students are going to have some channel to go reach out to their customers and actually ask them for that currency. Now, if they've done their problem interviews correctly and they've asked the right questions, they will know the answer to this. They will know what their marketing channel is. So we have to make sure that we're teaching them how to ask the right questions. And you can help them make sure they figure out what their optimal marketing channel is. The second thing they need is an MVP. They need a minimum viable product to demonstrate to the customer that they can actually solve the problem. Now what's critical here is that when I talk about an MVP, I'm not talking about like a working prototype. What I'm talking about very simply is a description of the problem that they want to solve and an explanation of how they're going to solve it. That's it. Just those two things. So this style of MVP can be something as simple as a PowerPoint deck. It can be a landing page. It can be a Kickstarter campaign. Anything that describes the problem that they're going to solve and how they're going to solve it. All right, the third thing that they need for their currency test is some form of success metric. When your students are running any experiment, they need some way to tell whether they have validated or invalidated their assumption. Some way to know if their student or their customers have paid them enough to make it worthwhile to solve this problem. So the exercise we have for you there is the currency test template. So I'm going to open that one up. Oh, I'll make it active. So boom, there you go. All right, so in our currency test, we're going to take our air bed and breakfast example, and we're going to write this up as if they were going to describe their very first experiment as a currency test, which is what it was. So air bed and breakfast, what marketing channel did they use? Well, it turns out they used the Design Conference Forum. So they were talking to people who were already attending the design conference. And the way that your students are going to figure out their channel is by talking to their customers and asking them, where are you looking for solutions to this problem right now? And so when your students ask their customers where they're already looking for solutions, they will discover where they should go and promote their potential solution. All right, the next step is that students are going to describe their MVP. Again, it doesn't need to be a full working prototype. We don't need to go crazy here. All we need to do is demonstrate what problem they're going to try and solve and how they're going to try and solve it. So in this case, they're going to have a simple website that describes that they're renting out airbeds and they're going to charge $80 a night and they're going to include breakfast. All right, the third step is to define a time bound or a time box for the experiment. So your students should know that we don't want experiments running forever. They need to have set limits so they can actually test and extrapolate, for example, how much currency they could generate over a longer period of time from a short period of time. So let it run for 2 weeks and then they can estimate, well, if we let this keep going and access to others, other customers, we think we could generate this amount of money over a year. All right, so they time bound their exercise and then they define their success metric stoplight. We call it a stoplight because we think it's more powerful not to come up with two metrics and not just one. So to do that, they're first going to define kind of the unit of their metric. So what category of metric are they going to collect? So in this case, our students are writing up the revenue. So they're testing for revenue. They want to try and get revenue from the customers. And then they need to come up with two metrics. The first is what we call their green light or their success metric. What this means is if they get at least this amount of metrics, so this amount of revenue, they will hit their green light, which means they can proceed and go and test the next assumption in their business model. So in this case, let's say they're going to run over the weekend, they want to rent out 3 airbeds, $80 a piece. If they get at least $500, they're going to say, you know what, we validated that this is a real problem that people want to pay to solve, and they're going to pay us enough to make it worth solving. So this is our green light metric. If we get at least $500, we're going to move forward. The other metric that they define is their failure metric. Their failure metric says if we don't get at least $200, something has gone wrong. And that means that we need to seriously think about what we're doing. So this is their red light, we need to go and pivot. And the reason why we have them define 2 instead of 1 is if they just defined one metric, let's say they defined $500, and they came up with $400. That's where they ended up. Normally, like the way we teach would say, oh, well, that's a failure, you need to stop and pivot. But that doesn't make a lot of sense because if you fall into this range, maybe there's something else you can do, something you can optimize, something you can change so that you can ultimately hit your success metric. And so that's why we have this 3-tiered stoplight metaphor. If they hit their green light, they're going to proceed forward. Let's say their next experiment is to rent out the whole house, right? Because that's their goal ultimately, let's say, is to rent out individual houses. If they end up in this yellow light, the next experiment, the next tweak they'll run to their experiment is they'll raise their price and they'll try it again. And so here you're teaching them how to iterate on their experiments and use the feedback they get from their experiment to go and change their iterations. And it's before they've even started their experiment. And then finally, they're going to write up what pivot they're going to make if this fails. And the reason why we want them to do this all before they run the experiment is it prevents analysis paralysis, prevents infighting amongst teams. If they all agree ahead of time, okay, if this fails, then here's what we're going to do next, you'll have a lot better alignment in terms of running your experiments and then figuring out what the next experiment is after that. All right, my friends, so that is the currency testing exercise. Again, if you want to save that, feel free to click the Save to Google Drive button. And now we're going to just basically sort of wrap up and close up the show by talking about what we've talked about. So we've talked about how to get buy-in. Talked about getting buy-in by talking about problems and not products and helping your students see that pattern over and over and over again in companies that they are familiar with. Airbnb, Uber, Facebook, Dropbox. We talked about, after you've got their buy-in, how to help them hypothesize problems that they are uniquely suited to solve. So they do that by helping them find people that they are uniquely suited to serve. And when you do this, you will shift their attention from idea generation to problem solving, and they will create much more interesting business ideas as a result of that. Third thing we talked about was customer discovery and problem discovery. How to help your students figure out the right people to interview, helping them identify who their early adopters are and how to find them. And finally, we talked about problem confirmation, because a problem isn't validated until you've confirmed customers will actually pay for that. And we talked about how to use the currency test template to help your students run an experiment to determine if people will actually pay to solve their problem. So these are 4 exercises that we've shown you so far. And if you recall, the very first question that we wanted you to kind of think about and seed in your brain was, do you want to use these in your class? Because if you do, these are 4 of the 35 total exercises that we want to create. So we've got a bunch more created, and we want to create even more, but we don't know how much of our own resources and time we can dedicate to this until we run our own currency test, which is what this is. Right? We've shown you what the problem is. We've shown you how we can solve it. We've even given you tools to help solve it. But if you want to use these in depth in your class, then we're running a test now to see if you guys want to use EXEC. And EXEC is our experiential entrepreneurship curriculum. So if this is something you want to use in your class, I'm going to open up this form here. And you can just fill this out, and you can request access to our full, complete set of exercises. Okay, so things to know about these exercises. Again, like your currency test, we need to go and validate our sustainable revenue model. And we think that we need to charge $99 per student in order to build this in a sustainable way and continue developing. So just a heads up, that's kind of the model we're looking at. So we either are looking for students to pay this on their own if you assign this as a resource that they need to get for your class, or if your organization that you teach for, your university, pays for these on behalf of students. That's where we think we need to go. Now, if your university doesn't pay for things like that, and there's no resources for it all, well, know that you can use what we've talked about today as inspiration to create your own versions, or we've got lots of stuff available on teachingentrpreneurship.org that you can use for free. So with that said, the last step is basically just to open up feedback. So I'm going to turn on our feedback form here, and feel free to leave us some feedback on what worked, what didn't work, what you liked, what you didn't like, so we can improve this kind of experience going forward. And with that, I will wrap it up by saying thank you so much for attending. We're going to spend a few minutes here answering some questions that you might have. So if you want to stick around and ask some more questions, feel free to. Otherwise, thank you so much for coming. It's been great having you here, and we're looking forward to your feedback and how we can improve going forward. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Cool. All right, Doan. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, so Kevin Gadd had a good sort of challenge, so I wanted to see if you wanted to clarify or address this. So, he was talking about sort of a definition of MVP, and by definition, it's something that has to be viable, and he was getting a sense from you that you were pointing to something less than viable was okay, and which maybe goes counterintuitive to the concept of an MVP. So I just thought
Yeah, it's a great question.
you wanted
Yes.
to address that. Yep.
Please, and if anyone else out there has questions that are challenging what I've said, please put them in there. You don't even have to make them questions. You can make them like, you can yell at us if you want, because this is the kind of thing we want to talk about. So V in viable is the least useful part of that acronym, and it's most confusing in its lame. Like, to be honest, I hate the term MVP. It just, because it even has the word product in it. Like, what the heck? We're trying to teach people to solve problems, and we're telling them to go out and build products. So the point of an MVP is to test your riskiest assumption with the least amount of investment. What that means is that you will not create one MVP. You will create several MVPs over and over and over again, each time testing the riskiest assumption of a business model with the least amount of investment. So viable in this case, in what we're talking about here for a currency test, viable only means that your customers believe it is viable enough to solve their problem. And you'd be surprised how few customers actually need to see the thing solve their problem to actually believe that it will solve their problem. Like, you don't need to show someone the software you're going to build, because people have faith, they have trust that you can actually build the software. The thing that they don't believe is that you understand their problem and that you can solve them. So in terms of viability, you need to think about viability in terms of just the one thing you're testing right now, and know that you will create, after that currency test MVP of that landing page, you'll create another MVP to test your next riskiest assumption, which is that you can actually solve the problem. And in that case, the MVP you're going to build is a manual MVP, a low fidelity MVP, something that's not automated at all. And so would you consider that viable? Well, it's not viable for long-term scaling, but it's viable enough to prove that you can solve that problem manually. Once you finish that, the next MVP you're going to build is going to be to prove that you can solve the problem viably in a scalable way. So great question. Yes, you're absolutely right. Viability is important, but not in terms of all of total viability. It's just to test the viability that you can solve the most risky assumption. Awesome.
Great. And then Jay also had another question about, when it comes to metric testing, how do you know the metric testing isn't based on failure of a problem or failure of an experiment? Ooh, sorry, I just got a whole deluge of questions here. Let me find it again.
Oh, no, I got it. It's Jay Smith. How do you know? I've just marked it as answer, right?
Okay.
Yeah, so how do you know the metric is not based on a failure of the experiment design / poor execution? Okay, so I think the question is failure of experiment design. So you go out and fail. The student goes out, they run their experiment, it fails. How do we know that there was actually a market result as opposed to like just a crappy experiment design or execution? Well, that's what we're testing here. It's all the same, right? Because your student's ability to execute is their delivery of the problem solution, right? And so it's all one and the same. And if they need help practicing over and over again, delivering the solution, then that's what this is about too, right? They're iterating on their ability to deliver experiences for their customers and experiments for their customers. And so I think I see what you're saying. Like, let's say they got the marketing channel right, they got the marketing copy right, but their delivery of the execution or the tech just failed. Well, that's why we iterate. That's why we run these really small tests, to help them try and do that over and over and over again to practice until they get it right. So, Jay, that's a great question. If I got it right, good. If I got the answer wrong, or I didn't quite understand your question, then go ahead and let us know, and we'll try again. Awesome, Doan. We got anything else?
Let's see. We got. So, and my apologies if I'm mispronouncing. I'm keenly aware of that given my goofy first name. But Elon had sort of a cautionary note that I thought was interesting in terms of, being cautious against suggesting students promise to solve a problem without showing them they can actually do that. So I wanted to bring that up because I think a lot of times we as educators talk about doing this stuff, and maybe kind of overpromise or over exaggerate what we think the students are capable of doing. So I think they're, part of what what I think Justin and I are trying to do here as well is inject a bit of reality and keep things simplistic in a sense to where they can actually do things and experience some failure and experience sort of the ups and downs in within the course of a semester.
Yeah. Okay, so and I think that if I'm interpreting this question, it's like, hey, we need to make sure that students aren't promising that they can deliver the moon, right? And that's fair. What I want to sort of emphasize, though, is that of all the risky assumptions in a business model, that they can solve the problem is one. It is a risky assumption, but it is far, far, far less risky than that people actually want to solve the problem. Turns out we as humans are really, really good problem solvers. And with enough demand to solve a problem, we will almost always find a way to solve it. So that's not to say that we don't test that. It's just that we test that later on in the process because we have more confidence that we can solve the problem than we have confidence that people are trying to solve the problem. And if we are trying to focus our students' energy, they're naturally going to want to go test that one, exactly what you're talking about, because they're afraid of failing in front of everyone. But what we need to enable them to do is see, like, you know what, you're a smart person. You can probably figure out a solution to a problem if there's enough demand to solve it. So it's a good point, but that's kind of why we're emphasizing problems so much.
Yeah, and then here, James had an interesting question. Do you still advocate solution interviews, or are we moving more towards landing page metric kind of things?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, James, that's great. So so what he's talking about here is solution interviews, for those of you who aren't familiar, to have a one-on-one discussion with your customers like you have with a problem interview where you talk to them about their problem. In a solution interview, you revisit those customers or a same customer segment, and then you say, hey, here are the problems that I think I heard you say. And then you confirm that you heard the problems correctly. Okay, great. Then you show them the solution. You say, hey, here's the solution that we think we're going to solve. What do you think? And you get to have them call their baby ugly, right? Get to say, hey, here are all the things that are not great about your solution. And then you collaborate together to fix them, and then you talk about what your next steps are. And so you have this collaborative conversation where you're actually creating the solution together. Now, James's question here about, hey, are we still doing that, or are we just focused on landing pages and conversions? Well, I'll tell you, the best thing that I've seen is actually a combo of the two. So, for example, what we did with Exec on our landing page, we actually, so if you haven't seen it already, if you go to teachingentrpreneurship.org/exec, you'll see a landing page there. And what we did is we set up solution interviews with about a dozen professors. And what we did is we got them on the web page, we got them on a Skype call. We gave them the web page, and we said, we want you to actually go through the landing page, and we want you to just think out loud what you are seeing and what you're experiencing as you go through this web page. And what they did was basically rip our landing page apart and tell us all the things that were wrong with it, right? And so you can do the same thing with your students. You can teach your students how to go find a customer, put together an MVP, whether it's a landing page or a PowerPoint deck or whatever, then have them go out and do a solution interview with their customers and say, hey, here are the problems I heard you say. Here's how we think we're going to solve it. What do you think? What do you like? What don't you like? They'll take that feedback and they'll continue iterating their pitch over and over again until they feel confident, yes, I've got the right thing. And then they can move over to a currency test and actually start doing it at scale. So fantastic question, James. That's spot on. I love it. So there you go.
Oh, there we go. Let's see. So David, and maybe...
Actually, before we do that, let me just, so go ahead and queue up the next question,
yeah.
but just so everyone knows, we're going to keep answering questions probably for the next, I don't know, either a half hour or until we answer them all. So if you've asked a question and we haven't gotten to it yet and you need to go, feel free to take off. We're going to send out a recording of this so that everyone has access to it. But if you want to hang out, we'll be here for the next little while just answering questions. So feel free to hang out with us.
Yes, and I think David had a good sort of general question in terms of, are there other, I think what he's asking, and David, please clarify if you're still around, is are there other materials, text, videos, et cetera, that we use with these kind of worksheets and things that we're developing?
Yes, absolutely. So all of the exercises we showed, they all come with a full text write-up that describes, sort of like I was doing, you saw me describe the relationship between an inventor and an entrepreneur. The text all describes that, and they come with step-by-step instructions. And then, if we get enough support in our currency test, then we already have that. That's already done. But if we get enough interest, then we'll go create videos as well. So yes, and all these exercises can be done. You get to decide as a professor, do you want them done outside of class or inside class with you? But you'll have the flexibility to do all of that.
Great. And then Brian had asked if we can provide a brief example of sort of usable experiment platform, SurveyMonkey Q&A, kind of how do we go about building a usable experiment, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay. So
Okay.
if you haven't already seen our 60-minute MVP exercise, let me see if I can pull it up here. Okay, we're gonna do this. So hold on, everyone, while I pull up 60-minute MVP. Okay, so what will, and I'm actually going to pull up the instructions here. Okay, so one of the, go, okay. So I haven't optimized the screen for this, so it will be a little difficult to see. But one of the exercises we have in the actual curriculum actually helps your students create an MVP, one of these MVPs, on a platform called Unbounce. So Unbounce helps them create a very simple A/B testable landing page, which has got A/B testing built in. It also, this exercise shows them how to create an explainer video and how to actually get credit card-based pre-orders. And so the combination of these three things will actually help them create their MVP that they can go out and run a currency test. So that's one great example of places that they can go, and platform they can use.
Great. And then Cynthia had a really good question here. So once they've gone out and done their interviews, one of the big challenges I think many of us face is how do you get them to develop really sort of true, accurate, deep insights from those interviews. So suggestions or things we're doing to help facilitate that process of pulling the information out of the interviews.
Yeah, great. Okay, so there are two things that come to mind in terms of interview analysis. The first is, I'll emphasize this again, it is so critical that your students are interviewing the right people. Because when it is difficult to analyze their interviews, it's a sign that they are interviewing people across a customer segment. So they might not be interviewing their early adopters. They are interviewing people who are early adopters. Like imagine they interviewed everyone who was going to that design conference in our example. And you ask them, what's the hardest part about coming to the design conference? If they talk to the late majority or the laggards, they're going to hear things like, oh, the ticket price is too high. Or they're going to hear things like, the food sucks, right? But when they interview the early adopters, that small segment of people who are actually trying to solve the problem, it's like magic. They will be floored. It will hit them over the face that there's a consistent problem. And we say you're not done interviewing until at least 60% of the people you're interviewing are all actively seeking a solution to the same problem. And so that's the one thing that's going to help really analyze. Because like I said, if they're having problems understanding what people are saying, it's a sign that they may be interviewing people across a customer segment. Now, the second thing that that you're going to do is we actually have a series of basically 6 insights that we want them to pull from their interviews, and we can walk them through that. So insights like, what sucks about your competition? So your students are going to do, your customers are going to do the competitive analysis for you. So they're going to ask what's not ideal about the current solutions. They're going to ask where they're currently looking for solutions. They're going to ask about emotions. They're going to ask about problems, etc. And so when they ask the right questions, you'll be able to clearly map onto where those go in and where those fill in to do their analysis. So it's kind of like sort of quality information in, quality information comes out. So we've got some exercises in there. It's called problem synthesis, and it will walk students through exactly how to go and analyze those interviews.
Great. So I'm gonna combine a couple things here. David and James kind of have a question statement that leads into something I think is very relevant and important. So David's asking, right? You don't use sort of value proposition design, business model generation. Lean Canvas is another one that's out there. We don't use anything like that. Just use your own material. And then, sorry, let me find it.
Yeah.
James is kind of making a suggestion about, collaborative environment where professors can share readings, videos, tools. So this sort of speaks a little bit just into how this partners with some of those other things that are out there, and then also the sort of resource library, I guess, that we're working to put together.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a great question, and David, you're spot on. So many professors use the business model canvas and the value proposition canvas. They are integrated into what we're doing. What we talked about today was basically how to take those tools to the next level. So presumably your students are already going to be filling out one of the canvases. And then if you want to walk them through how to actually validate those assumptions in those canvas, those are the tools we're talking about today. So how to actually validate those assumptions. And as far as collaboration goes, spot on. So one of the things that we want to add to this curriculum is a resource database, basically of other tools that professors either find online or maybe they create themselves. They submit them, and then we would love for the community to help curate them, to basically say, I've used this, here's what I like, here's what I don't like. So we can't promise that we'll actually be able to build that, but it's kind of where we're headed and where we'd like to go. Great comments.
Yep. Ibrahim was asking about time as a constraint for students. Is a semester long enough? Maybe a quarter, maybe a condensed summer time period, all these kind of different things. So, and just so you know, Justin, I threw my 2 cents in here that, part of what we're trying to do is develop something that is very flexible. And I said modular, maybe that wasn't the right choice of words, but, your feedback on that time constraint.
Yeah, you're spot on. Like, to be totally blunt, no, a semester is not enough time. Like, it's just not. But that doesn't mean that you have more time, right? So let's work with the situation you have, and Doan's point about flexibility is exactly right. So we're building this curriculum so that it can be used. It's used in a couple of 8-week classes right now. It can be used in a 16-week class. It can be used in a 2-year program. And the idea is that we've all got these exercises and tools that teach skills, and you get to kind of cherry pick the ones that are most applicable for you, and run them in the class. The idea is that students will have, we hope, our intention is that they'll have lifetime access to this, so that even if you don't get to everything in your course, the things in here are still relevant no matter where they go in life. So even if you only get to half the exercises, if they end up going and working for someone else and they launch a new initiative for someone else, customer interviewing is still going to be super important. How to ask for those interviews, how to do their market testing, that's all really relevant. So yes, it's designed to be super flexible, but if you wanted to know like how long ideally we think this process should run, that's a discussion for another time. I think my answer starts with about 4 years.
Yeah, right. Longer than a degree. So David is asking how well it'd work as an online class, and I can speak to directly from a professor standpoint of using some of these things in an online class environment, and it works phenomenally well in terms of the student's ability to create and share and collaborate, the professor's ability to see the work, give feedback, grade, all that kind of a thing. So from a professor standpoint, I can say it really, really works well just because of the interactive nature of it.
Cool. I'll have you have the last word on that.
and that's that. Okay. No, but it really does work very well, and that's also part of what we're trying to do is develop something that works both in class and online hybrid. As more people are moving that way, we want to have something that people can use in those kind of environments. And the kicking the tires I've done on it has worked very well. So let's see, William asks any kind of examples of not using current social media. He admittedly is a social media laggard, so he apologizes in advance.
Let's see. So examples.
And I know we have a lot more of them out there who wouldn't admit it, so good for you, William, for admitting it.
Thanks for calling it out.
Kudos.
Social media. Okay, so I'm trying to imagine the context of this question came in. My guess is that it's referring to examples of externally observable behaviors that don't use social media. Is that right? Don't you think?
I think there's that. I think it could also address sometimes doing sort of customer interviewing or engaging with customers, maybe not through social media kind of things. So I think there's a couple ways that this could fit in there.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting here is that your students' customers will lead the way. So if it's in terms of actually interacting with customers, it doesn't matter whether it's social media or whether it's not, or whether you're a laggard or whether you're an expert in social media. The students' customers will lead the way. And so they need to go wherever their customers are. And if that's on social media, then great. They need to go there. If they're not, then fine. Go to where they actually are. And that extremely observable behaviors will help there.
And I can talk to this too, where I don't have the first clue about Snapchat, and I have no desire to have the first clue about Snapchat. But my students love it, and when they're working on problems for their customers, who are oftentimes other students, Snapchat oftentimes plays a big role in this. And I don't know anything about it. Not knowing anything about it doesn't prevent me from helping them to engage, because I don't need to know the specifics of Snapchat. I need to know the processes that I'm trying to encourage them to use, and then they just put on, as Justin said, they just put on their whatever platform or whatever means of communication or anything that is applicable to their customers. So just to kind of put a caveat on that, I found it's not necessary to understand these things in order to engage the students and get them knee deep in the process.
Great.
Let's see, challenges we have faced using the material.
Well, I'll tell you
None,
yeah,
David,
no,
none.
it's a lie.
Perfect.
It's a lie.
Next.
No, it's not
Okay.
true. Okay, so challenges we've faced using the material. So the very first, so we've been testing this for about a year so far in a subset of these, and things that were not right going around. So we didn't have, like, that problems not products worksheet. That's new. That's relatively new, and we realized that not all the students understood and had bought into the problem validation process. And so we added that exercise, and we've seen that students really understand the value now of this process because they can see other examples. Other things that didn't work well, we had some brainstorming and creativity exercises built in there, and we still do. And those are the kind of exercises that are really fun to do in class, because you get this cool atmosphere where people are coming up with crazy ideas and they're bouncing off each other. But if you assign them to be done out of class, they feel tedious. It's one of these things where you have to brainstorm, 50 different ways to solve a problem. And so, like, we're learning from feedback from our students, and each of our exercises, actually, students can review them, so they tell us what they like and what they don't like. And so we're learning feedback from them and from professors about what we're getting right and what we're getting wrong. So that will also be part of this journey. Is this entire next academic year, we'll be limiting access to universities who are up for testing this with us. And so we'll spend an entire year continuing to test this, drinking our own Kool-Aid and eating our own dog food in terms of iteration and making sure we solve the problem. So thanks for asking, David.
Absolutely. Let's see, Jay's back with, how do we help students do this better in a segment they're not a member of, such as a B2B kind of segment?
Mm-hmm.
So how can we help them, work in a context in which they're not a member of that sort of group?
Yeah. My favorite thing to do here is to actually basically work their way towards an expert in that area. And when I say expert in that area, what I mean is a member of that segment. So, okay, so imagine let's say they're going to try and solve problems for internet stock exchange quote providers, right? So first off, just a heads up, if they don't know that and they're not a member of that segment, you're going to see a little bit of passionate disconnect there. So they're just genuinely going to be harder to try and solve problems for, because they're not going to be that into it. But let's just to say they're into it, but they don't know how to get there. They would go find one person who's closer to that customer segment than they are. So maybe one of their parents has someone they work with for financial management. And they would say, hey, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Do you know anyone out there who is closer to me than, might have this problem, or is closer to having this problem? And so their parent might say, okay, well, I know someone who's actually a stockbroker, and so we'll introduce you to them. And then from there, we're basically looking to just get any warm lead or warm contact to someone who's a member of this segment. Once you get into that segment, then you start asking, where do I find other people like you? So once you get one, you only need one, you can say, hey, where can I find other people like you? And then that will help with the externally observable behaviors piece of this. So hopefully that helps. And then the other things you can do is basically just research and go and find different places. Let me go here. you can research and find other places to find those people. We just need one to get the conversation started, and then we kind of go from there. All right, so other questions? Don't mind at all. Thanks for the great questions. All right. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to take David's question here.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Okay, So David asks, do you think it would be useful to have some examples of failures like Google Plus in the problems, not products exercise? Hope you don't mind so many questions. Yeah, great question, David. A failure. What happens when you start? I think that's a really interesting idea, actually. Like kind of a counter example, so that they're trying to figure out like what problem is to solve, and they're just like, I don't know, like a non-existent problem, or maybe there is a problem that they can identify, and they just realize that people aren't trying to solve it. So thanks for the feedback, David. I think that's interesting. That's something for us to consider.
Yeah. Sorry, Justin, I lost the tab.
Oh,
Technical difficulties.
no worries. Okay, I'll take over from here. Okay, who do we got? Okay, so we've got here, Jay's asking, how do we help students do better work and understanding hypotheses? Okay, we just did that one. An
Here
answer? Okay, and then okay. Oh, awesome. So Stella's asking, what help can you give a teacher who needs to try out this methodology in a class of 250 students? So help that we can do there. So just so you know, like we've used this in university that has 100 student classes, 250 per semester. So we've done it at scale. And the things that we would love to do to add to what we've already created to these digital exercises is the class management. So for you to be able to see all of the input from your customers, or excuse me, from your students, be able to leave feedback on them and help assemble all of their output. So that's stuff we can do there. We'd also love to just have a conversation with you about what your needs are, because we're at the place now where we want to hear. And so if there's enough demand to solve problems, then let's talk about it. We'll talk about how to solve them. So we've got some ideas, and we'd love to learn more about them.
Yeah, and then circling back. Kevin had the question about MVP and viable and all this kind of thing. And so because he's a smart guy, he agrees with us. But again, right, we use this term, and it's a term that's very common. And so talking about that form and what we're doing is there sort of an optimal way for students, how they use the form, the worksheet that we have, given that we use this sort of MVP language.
Okay.
That's tough.
I see. I think the missing blank might be here, and I didn't address this, so I think I can understand why. We actually have exercises before this currency test that teach them about creating an MVP. And so maybe the missing piece is that just like we teach them how to identify their channel, and we teach them how to come up with success metric, and we teach them how to come up with MVP, that currency test is basically just us combining those things into an experiment. So that might be the thing that's missing. So we teach them how to do that stuff earlier on, and then we compile all that information together in the currency test. Do you think that answers the question?
I think so, yeah. And a part of it is, we don't have time to give everybody everything, and so there's some pieces that you didn't see here that I think will fill a lot of gaps for people. If you wanted to kind of take the time and request a preview and check it out, then I think a lot of questions get answered that way. Because they don't see everything here in an hour or whatnot. So I think that's all the questions we got.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, everyone who stuck around and for your great questions. We'll send out the video. Thank you, Doan, so much for being here and for moderating. And we will see you guys back on the teachingentrpreneurship.org email list. See ya.
Appreciate it, everybody. Thank you.